Before we begin, can I see, by way of a show of hands, who remembers their first time at the movies? Yeah? Good? Nearly everyone. Yeah, my first one was Toy Story. I think that was a pretty good start. Film is perhaps the defining art form of the modern world, and going to the cinema is a formative experience for millions of people. And for that reason alone, we as communists should take film seriously, if we're serious about understanding the consciousness of the working class. But comrades might have been forgiven for being a bit confused about the title for this talk. Marxism and Film, the History of Hollywood. What's Hollywood got to do with Marxism? What's Hollywood got to do with communism? Isn't Hollywood this engine that pumps out American imperialist propaganda? Well, yeah, it is that. But in the same way that US capitalism is the dominant and most reactionary power on the world stage, and the focal point of world politics, so Hollywood is the beating heart of the global capitalist film industry. It's had by far the biggest impact on the course of cinema history. And so just as the American Communist Revolution is the most decisive, ultimately, for the victory of communism on the world stage, precisely because the US is the mightiest capitalist power, a great responsibility falls on the US communists to revolutionize American cinema, to, if you like, rescue Hollywood, or at least its technique, expertise, and means of production from capitalism. And this would help facilitate an enormous leap forward for cinema as an art form. You know, Marx once said that workers suffer through the working day precisely so they can get on with their real lives. What does this mean, other than kicking back and enjoying themselves, engaging in culture, reading books, and watching movies? Cinema, as I said, is a mass medium, and it's a big part of the cultural life of the working class. It's also the quintessential capitalist art form. It can only exist as a result of industrialization, a world market, and a mass audience. Filmmaking is an inherently collective process involving dozens or even hundreds or even thousands of artists and technicians and marketers utilizing advanced recording technologies. The director-actor Orson Welles once said that a writer needs a pen, an artist needs a brush, but a filmmaker needs an army. And it's a particularly revolutionary art form precisely because of its universality. You don't even need to be able to read to follow the story. Lenin and Trotsky both recognized the power of cinema as a tool of propaganda, yes, but they didn't limit themselves to this. They didn't have a Philistine attitude to the movies. Trotsky called cinema an inexhaustible fount of impressions and emotions that he thought that what might one day outcompete vodka and the church. I don't know about that. Maybe under socialism we'll keep the vodka. In his writings on art in general, and cinema in particular, you see nothing of the bourgeois caricature of a grim, grey Marxist, only interested in economics and shunning entertainment media as just opium that bamboozles the masses. Trotsky calls the longing for amusement, distraction, sightseeing, and laughter the most legitimate desire of human nature. Naturally, cinema today is tainted by bourgeois ideology, it's controlled by capitalist institutions. That's easy to say. But the point, as Trotsky explains in Problems of Everyday Life, is to seize control of the means of film production so that a culturally educated working class can give satisfaction to the desire, I quote, for entertainment, a higher artistic quality, at the same time making amusement a weapon of collective education. Now, I think that's a pretty good mission statement for those of us who care about cinema today. Now, there are so many ways you could tackle this topic, but I'm going to try to focus on Hollywood for a few reasons, not because I think that Hollywood necessarily makes the best films. If comrades want to talk about different national cinema traditions or anything else, then please bring that into the discussion. Firstly, I'm focusing on Hollywood for the reason that I alluded to earlier. It's the hegemon of the global film industry. Secondly, because we're in LA, right? The word Hollywood's written on a mountain. And I'm sure we have comrades in this room whose studies and maybe working lives are directly tied to the film industry. But finally, because the history of Hollywood cinema also tells the story of American capitalism, albeit in a complex and multidimensional way. You know, there's never a one-to-one relationship between the economic base and the cultural superstructure. But nevertheless, the American dream of the Roaring Twenties, the Cold War paranoia of the post-war period, the social discord of the 70s, and the stagnation and decline thereafter all find a reflection in Hollywood, on and off the screen. Now, American cinema had an early primitive period, which bears little resemblance to the glossy corporate entertainment medium that we see today. Originally, cinema was a sideshow attraction of short reels, by which I mean spools of celluloid, of only a few minutes in length, were shown at carnivals and taverns. They were often pornographic, and I mean really pornographic. The earliest form of cinema venue was called the Nickelodeon, and it was called that because it cost a nickel to get in. They were typically in rough neighborhoods, and they had filthy reputations. The church and respectable people hated the Nickelodeons, and they were really popular. By 1907, there were 4,000 Nickelodeons across America, concentrated in New York and Chicago. And just as the robber barons deployed the Pinkertons to impose their rule over industrial production, the early cinema bosses won control over this lucrative new industry through naked gangsterism. Heard of Thomas Edison? Yeah? The guy who invented the light bulb? He didn't invent the light bulb. He was a swindler, he was a fat cat and a thief, and he did set up the Motion Picture Patents Company, known as the Trust, in 1908. It was a cabal, it was a gang to enforce his monopoly over film production. The Trust would literally send thugs to beat up competitors and smash all their equipment. Part of the reason that the founders of the big film studios fled the East Coast in the first place was to get away from Edison's goons. A few locations were considered. They nearly ended up in Cuba. History would have happened somewhat differently, I think, if they'd ended up there. But they eventually settled on a suburb in southern Los Angeles called Hollywood, or Hollywood Land originally. And it had a number of advantages. It's sunny throughout much of the year, and early film was shot outdoors on location before you had studio lighting. Plus, you've got a wide range of backdrops within a 50-mile radius. You've got mountains, woodland, seacoast, and deserts. But most importantly, labor was cheap. Right? There were powerful theatrical unions in New York and in Chicago that could enforce decent rates for their members, whereas LA was the US's biggest non-union city. And most of the men who established the studio system were from Europe. Many of them were Jews fleeing persecution. Samuel Goldwyn was from Warsaw. Adolf Zucker, who was the founder of Paramount, was Hungarian. Carl Laemmle of Universal Pictures was from Germany. And their rags to riches immigrant success stories were deliberately fed into a capitalist mythology of an American dream based on this meritocratic melting pot. And these petty bourgeois small traders who made it big eventually became known as the Moguls. You might have heard that, the movie Moguls. It comes from the barbarian conquerors of the Indian Empire. And there's nothing romantic about the way the Moguls established control over the film industry, as we'll see. And the race to build real estate for film lots and movie theaters saw a flow of big capital from Wall Street into Hollywood. And within a few years, the Moguls threw up these massive studio lots, which became vast film factories, churning out hundreds of films a year, like an assembly line. Instead of the seedy and diverse Nickelodeon, you started to see the emergence of these grand Art Deco movie palaces, owned by the studios and usually racially segregated. And this whole period saw a contradictory process. The investments and centralization of production pushed cinema forward as an art form. You saw a massive leap forward in sophistication from the single reel shorts of only a decade before. But with investment comes leverage. And the big capitalists used their financial backing to exert more ideological control over the medium. As films became more sophisticated, they became more effective tools of spreading reactionary propaganda. And in the Jim Crow era, cinema was especially used to spread the post-Reconstruction so-called lost cause myth about the Civil War, this idea that the Confederacy wasn't fighting for slavery, but the noble, doomed cause of states' rights. So you had films like D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which essentially... I know. horrifying movie that celebrated the KKK as heroes. It was condemned as racist at the time. It caused race riots when it was released. But here's the contradiction. It essentially invented modern film editing. But the language of film that we use today was invented by this horrible movie. Then take one of the best American silent films, The General by Buster Keaton. In 1926, it's an absolute masterpiece of stunt work, of scale, of slapstick comedy. It's still funny, and the plucky hero is a lovably clumsy engineer who spends the whole movie trying to join the Confederate Army to impress his girlfriend. That's literally the plot. So the movies were advanced artistically, but that actually made them more useful for spreading more vile ideas. Now, Hollywood's crushing dominance over the global film market was connected to the decline of Europe and the emergence of the USA as the foremost imperialist power. European cinema was previously more artistically advanced and experimental than American cinema, but the whole industry was decimated by war, whereas the US economy largely emerged unscathed from World War I and capitalized on the lack of competition. So in 1914, the United States produced just a little more than half of the world's motion pictures. By 1920, it was making nearly all of them. And so began Hollywood's so-called golden age, which ran up until the end of World War II. Now, it's called the golden age. I'm not implying that all of the films that were released at that time were good, but it was the peak of Hollywood's output and relevance in American culture. The studio lots were like miniature cities. MGM alone had 4,000 staff on its payroll. And with the introduction of sound, popularized by the release of The Jazz Singer in 1927, which is also pretty hard to watch these days, audiences and profits ballooned even further. By the 1930s, 95% of all film production in America was concentrated in the hands of 8 big studios, 5 majors and 3 minors, and the industry was so-called vertically integrated. That's a fancy way of saying it was a monopoly. The big studios had control not over just film production, but also distribution and exhibition through their ownership of film exchanges and theater chains. And this is also where the glitz and excess of Tinseltown starts to take shape, as well as Hollywood's reputation as a place of loose morals. And there's a really grim side to this. Studio bosses preyed, particularly on young actresses, flocking to Hollywood to make it big, with practices like the so-called casting couch, basically directors and studio bosses trading film roles for sex. Marilyn Monroe was actually propositioned in this way by the president of Columbia. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. This was very commonplace. So unfortunately, rats like Harvey Weinstein are part of a long-standing tradition. And the religious right became increasingly alarmed at Hollywood's salacious reputation, and they threatened federal regulation unless the industry cleaned up its act. And the reaction of the studio bosses to this pressure was, of course, totally hypocritical. The seedy practices continue behind the scenes, but the studio executives established the so-called production code for filmmakers in 1934, which was essentially self-censorship to avoid a conservative backlash and protect their profits. And it forbade any depiction of nudity, violence, or sin on screen. Even married couples in the movies had to be depicted in separate beds. At the same time, Wall Street capitalists really started using their financial support for the industry as leverage to extol the virtues of corporate capitalism and the American way of life. And especially during the Depression, they didn't want films that depicted what was really happening in society. What they wanted was to show harmonious, white, nuclear families enjoying the good life. In other words, the polar opposite to what most Americans were experiencing. Now, Trotsky once said that good arts must tell the truth, and it's pretty difficult to truthfully reflect life within these Puritan moral standards and political constraints. So the combined pressure of the production code and Wall Street started to have a stifling effect on the artistic content of American cinema. Films became increasingly safe. Lots of them were made. There were about 3,000 films released by Hollywood between 1934 and 1939, but very few that I would say leave a real mark on history. Has anyone ever heard of a film called The Great Ziegfeld? No, me either. One. I've got one guy who's seen it. I'd never heard of it, but apparently it won the Oscar for Best Picture in 1936. And even films in this period that hold up better, like Mutiny on the Bounty, for example, I'd say they're fine, but they're kind of forgettable. And this was the best Hollywood was offering. These were the best picture Oscar winners, surrounded by literal mountains of dreck. Absolute rubbish, bad romantic flicks, lousy musicals, unwatchable, overlong historical epics by Cecil B. DeMille. Now, there were exceptions, particularly, I would say, where the reality of the Depression started to peek through. Some of the late films of Charlie Chaplin, for example, who was a socialist, he was sympathetic to the Russian Revolution, are brilliant satires of how capitalism was crushing the American working class. There's a film called Modern Times, released in the same year as The Great Ziegfeld, 1936, that opens with a famous scene of Chaplin's iconic Little Tramp as a worker on an assembly line, and he fails to keep up with the speed of the machines, and he suffers a complete mental breakdown, and he's literally sucked into the machine itself. He's overwhelmed and consumed by this like tangle of gears and mechanical parts. It's a really powerful cinematic depiction of alienation. But it was a silent movie made by an old director. It wasn't really pushing the art form forward. And many of the biggest productions at this time were still being used to push reactionary propaganda. Take 1939's Gone with the Wind, for example. It's a lavish and expensive adaptation to Margaret Mitchell's romance novel set during the Civil War. The dodgy politics aside, in my view, it's also just bad. I think it's really ponderous and melodramatic, but it was a massive hit. It won 10 Oscars. And Hattie McDaniel, who was the first African-American to win an Oscar for her performance as Mammy, couldn't attend the premiere in Atlanta due to segregation laws. Shame. It took the Second World War, which shook the world from top to bottom, to break the creative impasse in Hollywood. The barbarism in Europe and the anxiety over the prospects of America joining the war saw Hollywood take a darker, moodier turn. And there was a late peak for the golden era, artistically. And you might notice at this point, and from here, that the history of Hollywood cinema is largely driven by artists from the old sclerotic empires of Europe, with a longer and more developed cultural tradition behind them, making films with money from the energetic new imperialist power of the USA behind them. Hollywood actually invents very little, and I'll come back to that, but it steals a lot. Now, during the war, a promising young Englishman named Alfred Hitchcock took Hollywood by storm with a string of masterpieces: Rebecca, Foreign Correspondent, Shadow of a Doubt. In 1941, Orson Welles' Citizen Kane gives this harrowing study of a megalomaniacal capitalist stripped of his humanity by money and success, and it was based on and really annoyed the real-life media baron and politician William Hearst. And it drew on German expressionist films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, with this high-contrast lighting, what you call chiaroscuro, with like a strong contrast between light and darkness to create these imposing, almost surreal, dramatic shadows. And then my favorite Golden Age director, Billy Wilder, who was born in Austria-Hungary, basically invented the film noir in 1944 with Double Indemnity. Some would say The Maltese Falcon, but I think it's Double Indemnity. And the protagonist of this film is an insurance salesman who enters into a criminal conspiracy with this manipulative femme fatale and conspires to murder her husband and collect the insurance money. It really annoyed the censors. It just barely got released at all. These were films that were pushing the code to its limit. You could see how the artistic ambitions in the industry were straining against the censorship imposed by the industry. Now, 1946 was Hollywood's most successful year in ticket sales, but immediately after this, the industry plunged into crisis, and there were a few different reasons. In 1948, an antitrust suit was brought against Paramount that broke up vertical integration, so the studios were no longer allowed to own the production and distribution of films. Then you had the double whammy of television, combined with the post-war boom, giving millions of American families the means to actually own a set, so suddenly film had this very dangerous competitor. But there was a political reason as well: the Cold War and the rise of McCarthyism. Class struggle and political and ideological struggle have been bubbling away in Hollywood for many years by this point. Hollywood was heavily unionized in the 1940s, despite the best efforts of the studio bosses. Ironically, despite the moguls originally fleeing the East Coast theatre unions to set up shop on the West Coast, the unions re-emerged in an even stronger form during the Depression. In 1933, the bosses tried to force studio workers to accept a 50% salary reduction. And in response, you saw the establishment of the Screenwriters Guild and the Screen Actors Guild. And thousands joined in the space of a few weeks. And events like the Spanish Civil War were also politicizing the working class and intelligentsia across US society. It's not an accident that the 1930s saw the Communist Party of the USA's membership grow to 50,000 and big struggles break out like the Minneapolis General Strike. But the moguls had a trump card. They had the mob. And the biggest Hollywood union at the time, representing craft workers, the International Association of Theatrical and Stage Employees, IATSE, a name you might recognize, in the 1930s was infiltrated by the mob. And the mobsters were in turn brought onto the payroll of the studios, and IATSE became a scab union. It became a strike-breaking union. Now, it's cleaned up its act somewhat since then, and it's led some genuine strikes in the last period, but this was not its most noble era. And at the same time, communist scaremongering was being used throughout the 30s and early 40s to attack labor organizing in Hollywood. In 1939, Texas Congressman Martin Dies leaked a list of 40 film personalities, including Humphrey Bogart, who he accused of supporting communist causes. People in Hollywood who'd supported sending money and solidarity to the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War were also on this list. And in 1941, Walt Disney took out advertisements in trade newspapers about the danger of communist agitators behind an animators strike. And this all came to a head in 1945, where a section of IATSE, their rank and file, split away to form the Conference of Studio Unions, the CSU. And basically, the CSU, they didn't have a clearly radical program per se, politically. They just wanted to be free of mob control and actually fight the bosses. And in March 1945, 10,000 set directors went on strike, demanding that the CSU, rather than IATSE, represent them. And they launched, to this day, still the longest strike in Hollywood history. It lasted for months. And aside from picketing productions, they used to go outside of the cinemas and shout spoilers at the crowd queuing for tickets, which I think is genius. And it all culminated in a mass picket outside of the Warner Bros. Main studio lots in Burbank on the 5th of October, 1945, so almost exactly 80 years ago. So this was Black Friday, where IATSE strike breakers attacked the pickets with chains, with hammers, with tear gas, backed up by the police, who were also on the studio boss's payroll, and they left 400 people severely injured. And though SAG was not formally involved in the strike, there was much sympathy from its members, a lot of solidarity, and left-leaning actors like Charlie Chaplin refused to cross the picket lines. But one SAG actor who did cross, a B-movie hack named Ronald Reagan, I've spoken the devil's name, accused the CSU of being part of, I quote, a Soviet effort to gain control of Hollywood. Now, the irony was the Communist Party opposed the 1945 strike because they were following the wartime policy coming from Moscow to maintain its truce with the imperialist allies. But the accusation of left-wing infiltration in Hollywood fitted with the anti-communist hysteria that was already being whipped up by the state. And Joseph McCarthy's House Committee of Un-American Activities, HUAC, launched a crackdown on real and imagined communists with help from Reagan, who named names for the FBI. And HUAC hauled dozens of Hollywood figures in for hearings, and 10 refused to testify. Technically 11, but Bertolt Brecht ran away. And that became the infamous Hollywood 10. And they were cited for contempt, they received fines and jail time, and a blacklist was opened up against hundreds of Hollywood figures under suspicion of communist activities, and they were prevented from working. And SAG, which soon after came under the leadership of Ronald Reagan, required that its members take a loyalty oath, and that included a condoning of the blacklist. By 1951, 324 people had been officially fired by the studios, but far more were secretly blacklisted and just couldn't get work. And this included some of Hollywood's best artists, some of whom continued to work under false names. For example, in 1936, the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay went to Robert Rich for The Brave One. Robert Rich was actually Dalton Trumbo, who joined the Communist Party in 1943 and refused to testify before the HUAC. And he was eventually credited for his superb script for Stanley Kubrick's Spartacus in 1960, after the star Douglas Kirk stuck his neck out for him. And that was kind of functionally the end of the blacklist, that particular reign of terror. But the damage had been done. This was a period where, combined with the end of vertical integration and competition from TV, as I mentioned, the US film industry entered into an artistic and economic slump. It had literally stripped away all of its best talent at precisely a moment where it was suffering economically. And it's a good example of Marx's point that peaks of art don't necessarily correspond to the general development of society, because US capitalism was booming at precisely a moment where Hollywood was busting. New technologies like color, film, and widescreen, and 3D, and smell-o-vision, that's a real thing, smell-o-vision. They couldn't tempt audiences back to the cinemas. And by 1962, Hollywood's yearly box office receipts had fallen to their lowest figure in history, about half of the immediate post-war figure. And I would say, with a few exceptions again, the 1950s and 60s, early 60s, they're kind of a wasteland for American film. Hitchcock made some really good films. Vertigo, Psycho come out in this period. Billy Wilder released, in my opinion, his best film, The Apartments, in 1960, about an office worker who rents out his apartment to colleagues for their affairs. That really scared the censors. And that's not an accident. The themes of these movies included prostitution, voyeurism, cross-dressing, suicide. It was pretty daring stuff that predicted where things were going in the next decade. But again, they were all made by older directors who had already been working for years. In general, if you look at the bulk of films released from 1950 to 1965 or so, still lots of romantic dramas, lots of historical epics and musicals, these well-established genres that were becoming stale. And then you have bloated flops like 20th Century Fox's Cleopatra in 1963 that almost destroyed the entire industry. It was genuinely not clear whether Hollywood as an entity would survive the 1960s. But the impasse started to break in the late 60s, which is in general a time of questioning and experimentation, a period of generational change as well in American society. And there were a few factors that bore upon Hollywood. Under vertical integration, the US studios were able to limit the number of foreign films that were shown in the States. But in the 60s, after vertical integration had already been wound up for a period, the experimental work of directors from France and Italy, like Godard, Truffaut, Fellini, Antonioni, was being screened and inspiring a new generation of American filmmakers. And many of these directors, the European directors that I mentioned, they also wrote essays for journals like Cahiers du Cinéma, which explored the philosophy and the science of film. And this new generation of American directors were reading and studying these essays and watching these films, often on new graduate film courses. And they were particularly drawn to Truffaut's idea of the director as auteur, as the unquestioned author and the main creative agent behind a work of art, as opposed to just one technician amongst many. And these new directors became known as the movie brats, people like John Cassavetes, Martin Scorsese, Peter Bogdanovich. And a lot of them cut their teeth in B-movies and even seedier productions. Francis Ford Coppola actually got his start in porn. And this was important in a way because it meant that the movie brats had open minds. They kind of came from the fringes. And they also benefited from the quiet dissolution of the production code. And they started openly telling stories that dealt with themes of sex and drug use and crime, where the heroes were often less than heroic. And they were clearly inspired by the social chaos of US society and US capitalism that had been rocked by the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. There was a mood of rebellion against the establishment that found its way into a brief renaissance for American cinema. I would say starting with Bonnie and Clyde in 1967, in which the audience is made to sympathize for literally two murderous outlaws. The movie brats also applied B-movie production practices, like using untrained and non-union actors and crews in so-called free-to-work states or over the border in Mexico to keep the cost of production cheap. And the studios, who were desperate to recover their relevance and to get the money coming back in, get the audiences back in, particularly the young audiences in, they gave modest budgets to this new generation of more radical, rebellious young auteurs. And some of these films saw massive returns. Bonnie and Clyde made $70 million off a $2.5 million budget in North America. Now, again, this process and this development is contradictory. You see the darkest side of the egotism and the impunity of this so-called auteur cinema in the terrible crimes of one of the most decorated of these directors, Roman Polanski, who raped the 13-year-old Samantha Gailey and fled to France, where he still lives, sheltered by the industry. He won another Academy Award in 2003 for The Pianist. But nevertheless, in this period, running from 1967 to 1975, now called the New Hollywood, you saw an incredible flowering of creativity. It can't be denied. You've got Taxi Driver, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Deliverance, A Clockwork Orange, The Godfather, The French Connection, Midnight Cowboy, Chinatown. And it's no accident that these films coincide with a period where revolution was in the air globally, and the post-war boom was winding down. The organic crisis of capitalism is literally sweating out of the pores of the new Hollywood cinema. The heroes are all rebels. The official institutions are the enemy. The older generation are depicted as clueless and hypocritical and incompetent, and the American dream is exposed as a hollow lie. There's kind of a cynicism that runs through these films as well, but nevertheless, you can't question the quality of the art that was being made. But the new Hollywood kind of burned bright and briefly. It was necessarily a short-lived flourishing, in part because giving these auteur directors so much power and autonomy sometimes saw them strike gold, but sometimes you'd end up with so-called runaway productions that turned into chaotic, expensive disasters. Heaven's Gate, for example, in 1980 by Michael Cimino, who directed The Deer Hunter. It's one of the most infamous box office bombs in history. It made $3.5 million against a $44 million budget. There's a scene in the film where they accidentally blow up 20 horses crossing over a bridge, and they kept it in the movie in the end. It was a mess, and there's this really sad anecdote where Cimino was at the premiere, and people were leaving halfway through. This film's like 3 hours long, and one of his friends, I forget his name, one of the actors, he came up to him, Cimino, and said, "Why are they all leaving? Why are they all leaving?" And he went, "Mike, they hate it." Mike, they hate the movie. So the studios started to panic, and they started looking for a more reliable form of investment. And they eventually settled on it with the blockbuster, which I would say is really the only true homegrown innovation of Hollywood. It's the only thing the industry really invented. And I'd say the master of this genre is Steven Spielberg. He was a movie brat. He was of that generation. And he was hired by Universal to adapt a novel about a shark called Jaws in 1975. And in scope, Jaws is basically a B-movie. It's a B-movie creature feature with a budget. Universal made the novel move of purchasing a huge amount of newspaper advertisements, a so-called exploitation campaign that almost matched the budget of production, which was really unusual for the time. But it was a massive success. Jaws made $490 million against a $9 million budget. And it was followed a couple of years later by Star Wars, which made even more money by following a similar pattern, combined with aggressive merchandising. I mean, let's be real, Star Wars is at least half an advertisement for toys, right? And it always was, and George Lucas made his money by recognizing that fact. And these films established the blockbuster. And it's called the blockbuster because you had lines of people queuing for tickets literally around the block. It busts the block. And it became Hollywood's new formula, and I would say really remains Hollywood's main formula, investing in a relatively small number of high-budget, so-called tentpole films with fairly simplistic plots intended to appeal to as wide of an audience as possible and propping up the entire industry like tentpoles. And this formula was extremely profitable for a while, but while a handful of films sold a huge number of tickets, overall ticket sales have trended downwards since the 1950s, actually, even before the 70s. Accelerated, of course, in part by home viewing. You have the introduction of video in the 1980s, but that doesn't explain all of it. Another legacy of the new Hollywood was that it helped to undermine the authority of the big Hollywood unions. They were already dented by the beginning of the collapse of the studio system where they thrived, but they weren't able to adapt to the success of these small crew, non-union productions by the auteur movie brats. And that was combined with sustained attacks by the Reagan administration that we've already talked about. And the consequence, ultimately falling down to poor leadership on behalf of the mass organizations of the workers of Hollywood, saw union density in the industry fall from 90% in 1979 to about 50% in the 1980s. And as US capitalism as a whole entered into a period of organic crisis, so Hollywood entered a phase of commercial and creative stagnation, from which I would say it's never really emerged. I mean, Hollywood today is a shadow of its former glory. I wrote that before I actually came here, but everything I've been told sort of confirms what I suspected from the outside. From a peak attendance of 4 billion movie tickets bought by North Americans in 1946, in 2024, the figure was about a fifth, 760 million. And film output has collapsed. Last year, there were 679 feature film productions in Hollywood, compared to the thousands produced annually during Hollywood's golden age. Now, TV production, so Hollywood TV production, boomed, I would say commercially and artistically, with the introduction of premium cable, like HBO in the 2000s, and streaming in the 2010s. But that's also now going into reverse. And that's a process that's been accelerated by the pandemic, and that was met with the big strikes of 2023. In 2022, there were 142,000 people employed by the motion picture industry in Los Angeles. And by the end of last year, it was 100,000. So you've lost 42,000 jobs across the industry in a couple of years. Last year, 30% fewer movies and TV shows with budgets of at least 40 million, so premium productions, began shooting compared to 2022, so a 30% collapse in 2 years. And that fell another 13% in the first 3 quarters of this year. And this has all had a knock-on effect internationally. My wife is a special effects technician in London, and her company produces props for big productions like Star Wars and House of the Dragon and this sort of thing. And her colleagues, a lot of whom are also working freelance, have seen all their work begin to dry up. The last 18 months or so have been extremely difficult. And I've spoken to a few comrades here who are in various ways associated with the industry or know people working in the industry who report the same thing. Now, Trump's attempts to boost Hollywood and the American film industry with 100% tariffs on non-US productions will make this situation worse internationally, potentially, and it's unlikely to help Hollywood, in part because enforcing those tariffs is a logistical nightmare. Like, what exactly are you taxing? But in the absence of some sort of incentive to encourage domestic investment, will probably just bloat production costs and further depress overall film production. So like I said, artistically and commercially speaking, Hollywood never returned to its peak. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that literally no good films have come out of the States since 1978. In fact, some of my favorite movies were released in this period. You know, I came in with a Jurassic Park backpack. And you've got Blade Runner, The Matrix, Being John Malkovich, No Country for Old Men. There are loads of good films that are released in that period. But I would say that as a trend, it's an objective fact that Hollywood has been responding to its declining fortunes and every new technology, from home video to streaming, by becoming increasingly conservative. And that's combined with a further monopolization of the industry. A small number of well-established franchises, usually borrowed from other media like comics and video games more recently, dominate modern screens. And rather than adding anything new to culture, a tiny cabal of mega conglomerates are betting big on a tiny number of bloated and usually pretty artistically vacuous productions that are considered flops if they literally don't notch $1 billion. That is an insane bet on the future of an industry. Look at the highest grossing films of the last 10 years. 8 out of 10 were owned by Disney. All of them are part of existing franchises, and one of them is a remake of a film that Disney already made 30 years ago, the live-action Lion King movie, which is so hard to watch. Please no one bring that film into the discussion other than to criticize it. There's very little room for experimentation or truly novel ideas in this sort of environment, and even less to make political statements. We've written a few times in our material about how very few artists in Hollywood have spoken up about the main political issue of the day, which is clearly the genocide in Gaza. And even fewer have touched on that subject through their art. And that's partly due to the pressure of studio bosses and investors who, of course, are tied by 1,000 threads to American capitalism and reflect the interests of American capitalism and are wary of a backlash hitting their pockets. Not to mention direct state pressure. I haven't had time to talk about the influence of the US Army over Hollywood, other than to say that Michael Bay is their puppet. And you also have increasing nepotism in Hollywood. So every significant player in the industry, from actors through to writers, through to directors and producers, they all know someone, they're all related to someone. They're all the kids of people who are already the kind of titans of the industry. They're all related to some executive or another. They're all part of these big Hollywood dynasties. And that can't but help mean that you have a narrowing sphere of experience and a narrowing perspective that's brought to the art that Hollywood makes. And of course, anyone who does dare speaking out risks getting crucified under what I would describe as a new regime of McCarthyism. And nobody's safe. Susan Sarandon is one of Hollywood's finest actresses, in my opinion. And she was dropped by her talent agency a couple of years ago for speaking out on Gaza. Literally the closest we've seen to a mainstream production lately, sort of dipping its toe into this question, was Superman defending defenseless, unnamed Middle Eastern people from a mysterious US ally called, the State of Bisrael or something. No, Baravia, that was it, Baravia. That's about the best you get in mainstream Hollywood. Now, occasionally, Hollywood is forced to correspond to a certain extent to what people think and feel. I haven't seen it yet, but I hear that the new Paul Thomas Anderson movie, One Battle After Another, is kind of about, radical anarchisty left-wing people who try to blow everything up, and it shows a certain sympathy towards radical and revolutionary ideas. I mean, say what you like about it, but the original Joker movie, I don't think that it's a perfect film, but it captured something about people's anger towards the status quo, their feeling of a rot in society. And it's not an accident that workers on real strikes in France and in South Korea painted their face like the Joker for a couple of years after that movie came out. And it's a bit clearer on TV and in streaming, where the budgets are a bit lower and the producers can afford to take a few more risks, even in big franchise productions like Andor, for example. This is a show that's owned by Disney, and it's based in the Star Wars universe, but it deals pretty openly with themes of rebellion and revolution and genocide. I mean, clearly touching on the events of the day. Obviously, it has to be masked in a liberal veneer, and it never draws truly revolutionary conclusions. And the point, ultimately, it's the industry recognizing that if it's not going to lose the attention of audiences altogether, it has to offer them something that reflects something about what they're actually seeing and feeling. Actually, I would say that the majority of quality material these days is made for TV rather than for cinema, which is a big reversal of the last period. And of course, there's always going to be interesting work made at the fringes. But again, none of this changes the general picture of commercial crisis and artistic stagnation. Now, We've not seen yet how far AI is going to impact Hollywood, although you might have seen in the press recently there was talk of the studios battling over signing Tilly Norwood. Tilly Norwood isn't real. Tilly Norwood is an AI actress that the studios are apparently bidding to sign on. I spoke to a comrade who told me that they spoke to a childhood friend who is now a stunt director and also a voice actor. And he said that film studios are beginning to ask voice actors to sell their voices to train AI models, and they have to sign so-called non-compete contracts for a small fee, which means they can never work again because the studio has to own their voice. So for about $1,000, they are given that fee, and they never get to work in the industry as voice actors ever again. And apparently that's an increasingly common practice. It's not really hit the mainstream as a news item yet, but that's a bit of a hint of where things are going. I read a really interesting interview with Charlie Kaufman, who, in my opinion, is one of the last great scriptwriters left in Hollywood. And he made a good point that the use of generative AI, it's really just the culmination of the capitalist logic that's always been implicit in Hollywood. He said, if you start trying to figure out what it is that people want, you are doing what AI does. The idea of AI precedes AI itself, because that's the Hollywood machine. It's why they remake the same 5 movies every 10 years. It's why they have a formula for what a movie is. The Hollywood studio bosses aren't interested in making good art. What they want is a reliable formula for making films as cheaply, quickly, and profitably as possible. If those films happen to be good, that's an entirely secondary matter. That's why they rely on remakes and sequels rather than investing in and risking their money on new ideas. And AI, if you think about it, it's just the kind of apotheosis, it's just the end point of this logic, stripping the human element out altogether, that chaotic element, in favor of something that you can literally copy and paste over and over and over again. But the thing is, art is the human element. That is art. Art is a form of human communication. It's based in human emotion and human experience. And at the end of the day, that's what people want to see, right? And we've seen that the problem with so-called reliable formulas over the history of Hollywood cinema is they produce diminishing returns. We saw the same thing in the late 40s and 50s when the industry almost collapsed. We've seen it in the last couple of years with the oversaturation of Marvel movies, which has undermined their relevance. They're making a lot less money than they used to. I don't know about you, I don't remember the last time I watched a Marvel movie. I don't remember the last time someone spoke to me about a Marvel movie. I think the Endgame happened and everyone just stopped caring because there've been so many and they were all so similar that at a certain point you just don't care what happens to Iron Man or Spider-Man or whatever. I know Iron Man's dead, but you get my point. So who knows how overtly the studios will try to utilize AI in the future? I have no idea. But I am confident that audiences will get bored of being served reheated slop over and over again, and they'll vote with their feet. And eventually, it'll just feed back into the general crisis of the industry. Because as with capitalism as a whole, the crisis of Hollywood, it's not just a question of some bad decisions by some clueless executives. The logic of crisis is implicit in the system itself. It's immanent in the system itself. And the solution to that problem, it doesn't come through the art per se. It comes through revolution to transform the social relations that underpin that art, the economic system that facilitates that art. Because there's an ocean of talent and expertise surrounding us right here in LA. You know, I was thinking the other day about the Michael Bay Transformers movies, and they're awful. They're awful. They're terrible, terrible films. But the production, the special effects in particular, are astounding, really astounding. Those robots look real. They look absolutely real. And the talent and the time and the labor wasted on this, wasted on these garbage stories. It's a tragedy, if you think about it. All of the years of school, all of the training necessary to produce the skilled labor that can put that robot on the screen, and it's used to make this. That's an indictment of art under capitalism. That's as profound an indictment as anything that I can say here that Mr. Michael Bay has provided, with the kind patronage of the US Army. The capitalist market today is the greatest obstacle to the development of all aspects of society, from science to the economy to culture. And it's not as simple as just saying that it's because money is not going to the right projects or that money is being wasted. It's not as simple as that. The point is, the entire cultural sites of humanity are not where they should be. They're not what they could be. They're not equal to the technological marvels that we've already created. Just imagine what we could accomplish if the immense entertainment engine of Hollywood was managed by the working class, if artists were allowed to pursue the work and the interests that actually inspired them. The great Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein wrote, "Imagine a cinema which is not dominated by the dollar, a cinema industry where one man's pocket is not filled at the other's expense, which is not for the pockets of 2 or 3 people, but for the heads and hearts of 150 million people." That, I would say, in a paragraph, is what we are striving to accomplish when it comes to film and art in general under communism. In potential, I genuinely think that cinema is the highest accomplishment of bourgeois culture. I really do. It combines all the other arts, literature, theater, visual art, music, into one whole. It's what Wagner might have called a Gesamtwerk, the Gestalt art form, the total work. It combines all the others into one. It's a perfect synthesis of all the other art forms. But it's the crisis of bourgeois society that's limited its potential. It's not really about technique per se at this point. It's about raising the sights of humanity. The great Italian director Fellini once said that cinema is the language of dreams. But what can humanity dream of when it spends its waking life with its head in the gutter? That's the problem, right? I don't think, unfortunately, there's ever been a movie to match the works of Shakespeare or Beethoven in terms of pure artistic accomplishments. I think those films are yet to be made under a harmonious socialist society where film is freed from the profit margin and mankind's sights are raised to a higher level without the cultural and moral rot of exploitation and oppression and the demands of the bottom line. One when, rather than an industry dominated by fat cats and nepo babies, everyone with talent and a vision will have the chance to express it on screen. And that's the kind of cinema that only a socialist society can bring into being. Thank you.
I wanted to talk a little bit about Sergei Eisenstein. He was a Soviet filmmaker, and he was one member of a generation of artists who pledged their allegiance to the revolution and used their talents to assist it. Many of the best artists and intellectuals in Russia of that time and throughout the world pledged their allegiance to the Bolshevik Revolution because of the fact that art is limited by capitalism and the profit motive, among other reasons, obviously. But Eisenstein was responsible for the masterpiece Battleship Potemkin, which portrayed with a vivid ferocity revolutionary sailors who overthrew their naval officers and took control of the ship on which they worked and lived. But before this happens, the leader of the uprising is killed, and the people of Odessa rise up in solidarity with the sailors of the Potemkin. And when the Tsarist regime calls in the Navy, the ships refuse to fire on the Potemkin, and we see solidarity reign supreme. And Eisenstein also created October, 10 Days That Shook the World, in 1927, 10 years after the revolution, when the Stalinist bureaucracy had consolidated its control over the Soviet Union. And it was for this reason that Eisenstein was forced to make changes to his film, considering the many references to Trotsky as a leader of crucial importance in the seizure of power by the workers. Eisenstein, like other artists in the Soviet Union, was devastated to have experienced the bureaucracy stamp out the gains of the revolution that they were so devoted to and were in fact products of. And Lenin and Trotsky always spoke to the necessity of artistic freedom of expression, stating that the party and the state should not influence control over the creation of art or try to influence a particularly political art. The Bolsheviks' policy on the development of culture was one of encouragement of cultural development from within society, not imposition from above, and above all, of the eradication of the, economic and social conditions that, limited cultural development in the first place. And this policy was heavily related to education as well. Only 4 days after the Bolsheviks took power, Lunacharsky, the People's Commissar of Education, stated, "The laboring masses thirst after education. The government cannot give it to them, nor the intelligentsia, nor any force outside themselves. Schools, books, museums, theaters, and so on can only be aids. The people themselves, consciously or unconsciously, must evolve their own culture." But the Stalinists' mechanical and self-interested censorship and control of artistic expression was the complete opposite of a genuine Bolshevik policy in relation to art. And it was for this reason that Eisenstein left the Soviet Union, tried to go to France and to America and to other countries to create his films elsewhere. But the capitalist classes of these nations would have nothing to do with his productions, knowing that the content would be a revolutionary one. And so Eisenstein ends up returning to the Soviet Union, where he would continue to create films until his death, expressing his disdain for the Stalinists wherever possible, where he could avoid the censorship. And he ended up going into cardiac arrest while Stalin watched his final production. But it was while Eisenstein was still in the United States that he said the words that Joe quoted in his lead-off when the filmmaker instructed us to imagine a cinema that is not dominated by the dollar. And so the other side of that coin is a quote from a former head of CBS Paramount who says, "We are not in the business of making art. We are in the business of making money. If we happen to make art, that is a byproduct of our business." And it will be when capitalism is overthrown that we will see a revolution in cinema, and we will see a cinema that is able to truly use the language of dreams, like Fellini said, without the limitations that capitalism currently places on it. Thank you, comrades.
Joe explained how it's not a problem of the film industry, but of capitalist society itself. And he talked about how the low horizons and lack of dreams in cinema today ultimately reflect the low horizons of bourgeois culture and bourgeois ideas. In philosophy, this decay takes the form of postmodernism, and we have to be very, very careful of this method when we study films. In film studies and film schools, postmodernism lurks around every corner, in every nook and cranny, and it often disguises itself as Marxism, but it's anything but. At root, postmodernism is a form of subjective idealism, which argues that truth is only what you make it, and that only your own subjective experience produces reality. This is a wholly reactionary idea, because it means that there's no such thing as objective truth. If anyone's reality is right, then climate change denial is equal to fighting climate change. A Zionist is just as right as a Palestinian. Anyone can be a racist, and really no one can have any of their ideas challenged at all. When we talk about postmodernism, we use examples from science and politics to show how reactionary it is, but its role in art is equally reactionary. Now, I had the misfortune of going to film school for 2 years. I studied screenwriting, and I got to be a teaching assistant for an undergraduate class. It was very interesting to me how screenwriting was taught to these 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. I assumed that what we would do is watch a lot of movies, read a lot of screenplays, maybe a book or two on lessons from the history of screenwriting. Maybe we would even act out some of these scenes ourselves. Of course, I assumed we would write multiple screenplays, workshop them, and we'd write in all genres about anything and everything, because what's better than the imagination of a young person? Unfortunately, that's not what happened. What everyone was taught was to tell your story, to look within yourself and tell the world about what makes you you. In other words, rather than open these young minds to an entire world of literature, theater, film, science, philosophy, history, and amazing stories after stories, true and imaginary, we've confined them to their own limited subjective experience. The logic here is, of course, that everyone is unique. Everyone has their own stories, and everyone has to find something original to tell, which therefore must of course come from their own original life. Everyone is special, and everyone can produce something truly unique that will blow everyone else's mind because we are all different. But in practice, what all of my students produced was the most banal, cliche, overused, and formulaic drool that everyone and their mother has already seen a million times. I was stuck reading stories about kids who practiced really hard and won the big game, who had a relative die, who fell in love, who got dumped, who had a tough boss or a bad teacher, who started their hero's journey in Act 1, almost turned back in the second, but kept on and won in the third, and learned something about themselves while doing it. Why were these scripts so commonplace? Because under capitalism, every worker goes through some degree of the same development. Dialectics explains that there's a unity between the particular and the universal. The universal is made up of particulars, but each particular contains something universal. My particular experience with my particular boss might have its odds, but at the end of the day, it's just one variant of the exploitation that every worker experiences. This is exactly why movies are so powerful. While showing us a specific story, true or false, a good movie touches on something far bigger than any one of us, the human experience. Anyone ever wonder why Parasite, a movie from South Korea starring actors no American had ever heard of, directed by a guy whose name no one could pronounce, ended up becoming a world phenomenon that dominated the American Academy Awards? It's because everyone found something of themselves in a story about a struggling working class family. Anyone ever wonder why the works of Shakespeare still hold up, constantly adapted into new forms? Because there is something universal about these particular stories of revenge, betrayal, love, and tragedy. But postmodernism looks at it differently. For postmodernism, there's no such thing as a generalization or lawfulness. There's no such thing as a universal, only particulars. There's just a world of difference where everyone is different from everyone else. Nothing makes sense, everything is random, and no one can be understood. Not to mention, if everyone's subjective truth is amazing, there is no such thing as good art or bad art. No one can be criticized, but believe me, there is bad art, and some of this crap needs to be criticized. The irony, of course, is that in teaching these kids to tell their own stories, they ended up just writing a standard Hollywood movie. More proof that dialectics is true, whether or not you believe in it. And inevitably, this idealist method then led the teachers to teaching kids that somehow they could use their own stories to change the world, that somehow they could produce revolutionary art that would revolutionize the world, one streamed short film at a time. But this is a lie. A movie might make you think, but at the end of the day, it's just a movie. The best movies reflect the nature of class society, but they don't change this class society. It takes a class to do that. A class that needs to understand what makes it a class and not an aggregate of unrelated individuals. And so the task of artists today isn't to try to eke out a way to make some individual type of revolutionary art piece that may or may not be seen. It's to use your talents to build the revolutionary party, the only tool that can revolutionize all of art. So comrades might ask how I got through film school without falling into deep depression and cynicism. And the reason is because I didn't focus too much on the films or the classes. Well, I did watch a lot of movies, but I didn't focus on the classes. I used all of that time to read Lenin and build the RCA, the tool our class needs to build a world where all humanity has access to art and culture for the first time in history, and to set the stage for all new forms of and types that we can only imagine. So if you're an aspiring artist, I'd encourage you to do the same. And if you want some reading, I'd encourage this really great pamphlet from Alan Woods, which we have in the back. Thank you.
I believe in America are the first words uttered in Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather.
I believe in America. America has made my fortune, and I raised my daughter in the American fashion.
See, I start here because The Godfather is indeed one of my favorite films, right? And I know that Joe had brought it up as one of those films from that sort of new Hollywood era, right? But one of the reasons I love this film so much is that it is a film that does what all great art does. It tells the truth. Yes, maybe it tells that truth through lies, but it tells it nonetheless. From that pamphlet that Stan was just holding up, Alan Woods actually said this about art. Art represents a kind of mirror in which society can see itself reflected. To that end, I want to focus on two films. First, The Godfather, but then also Dziga Vertov's Soviet-era film, Man with a Movie Camera. And I want to compare two scenes that I think tell truth. Now, if we can return to those opening lines, I think the opening sequence of The Godfather is truly genius, right? We hear right away that phrase, I believe in America. But it's important to remember who is saying it. Who's saying it is a petty bourgeois undertaker, an Italian immigrant who did everything he was supposed to. He built a business. He built a fortune. He raised his children as Americans. But then he tells a grim and terrifying tale of how his daughter was beaten and raped by her friends. And when he went to the cops, nothing happened. There's so much to say about this film, but in this one interaction between this side character who only appears about 2 more times in the film, we see the themes of The Godfather laid out before us. A truth, if you will. The corruption of the justice system, the police, and society in general. Codes of honor that older generations feel are both fading away and failing them in their daily lives. And the way that American capitalism essentially forces one to use brutal methods in order to get ahead. And in the end, what does Bonacera have to do? He has to shamefully prostrate himself before the Don, and at some point even shamefully ask, "How much shall I pay?" It brings to mind the words from the Communist Manifesto. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. In other words, this film reflects as a mirror the capitalist system in 1972. But let's take a look at another to the other film that I wanted to talk about today, Man with a Movie Camera by Dziga Vertov. It was released in 1929. This silent film is regarded as one of the best and perhaps even first documentary films ever made. Indeed, it actually pioneered the genre. And if comrades have not seen this film, I suggest putting together a viewing party and have a film social on this film. I trust me, you will not be disappointed. Why? Because this film tells the story through documentary methods of the tale of a Soviet city, a day in the life of a Soviet city, a mass of the Soviet people told through film. There's wild and innovative shots that even to this day would be considered avant-garde and experimental. And many of these shots were developed through a process of montage that he developed in his Kino Pravda newsreel series, Kino Pravda meaning film truth, right? But the scene that I want to talk about is an ambulance scene, because one of the other things I think is so brilliant about this film is that it doesn't just show you like a city that is perfect or shining or anything like that. It shows a real Soviet city, and all. And that includes a tragedy where a young worker is harmed and needs to be taken to a hospital in an ambulance, right? Now, keep in mind, this is black and white, it's silent film. And yet, what I'm about to describe, like Lynch would make something like this, right? We see the young man put into an ambulance, but alongside this ambulance is also a kind of primitive like firefighter unit. But what Dziga did, what Vertov did, was he put camera crew in both vehicles. And so you're watching as these vehicles are moving back and forth, and this is montaged against other healthcare workers trying to save this young man's life, right? And it's moving back and forth, back and forth. And sometimes you actually see the camera move in and out of view, right? Where almost everybody else would say, oh no, we need the camera to disappear. Dziga Vertov actually put the camera people, and himself into the movie. Because after all, he is not removed from society. Indeed, I would say that ultimately what he was trying to do was make a point, that there is a dialectical relationship between the camera person and the subject. And for him, subject was society, and he was a part of that society. Only in a Soviet system, and especially one that was on its way up, could such art be made in the first place. Now, of course, you and I know that the degeneration of the Soviet state was just around the corner, and in fact, that process had already begun in 1929. But nonetheless, for the people of Soviet Ukraine, they had a future. Unlike what we see in The Godfather, where we see nothing but decline, these people have a future, and we see a city, a society on its way towards a bright and better future. In conclusion, I'd like to read another quote from Alan Woods from that same pamphlet. In a sense, all art potentially contains the germ of revolution because it represents a discontent with what is. Of course, we understand the limitations of art. We understand that for us, it is not the fundamental area of struggle. It is just one more area that we have to comment on and try to intervene in, try to establish some sort of a contact and dialogue with the best of the artists. To that end, I just want to make one last point. To me, the promise of socialism and communism is not that you have a roof over your head, food in your belly, and healthcare free at the point of service. Comrades, that is merely the precondition for socialism. That is merely the starting point. The real promise of socialism is that after we work, we get to be artists. We get to make film. We get to be athletes. We get to make music and paint and write and hang out with our goddamn families from time to time. So I suppose, in a way, I actually do believe in America. I believe that there is actually a promise to the American dream. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, including the pursuit of becoming an artist in your own right. But I believe firmly that it will be the American working class that will actually attain this promise. So perhaps I should say, I believe in the Soviet Socialist Republic of America.
The Russian Revolution was led by a working class, led in turn by the Bolsheviks, a class that was on a terribly low cultural level. I mean, I'm talking mass illiteracy. And Lenin made this point to some of the more starry-eyed, more petty bourgeois elements that were involved in the revolution, you know, the product cults and the people around the Nuchatsky, where he said, look, if we're talking about transforming the working class at the spiritual, cultural, fundamental level, we have to, first of all, at least conquer the highest achievements of the old society. Trotsky made this point as well. He said that you can't grow an oak tree out of a kidney bean. He said the very first thing we need to do is not start with the low level of culture the working class is granted, but first of all begin with the basics, solve the problem of bread, solve the problem of literacy, give the working class the means and the tools to understand what? To understand the highest accomplishments of bourgeois art and culture. And why bourgeois art and culture? Because the bourgeois had been the ruling class for hundreds of years. They'd had the opportunity to develop and refine their culture and their arts. And the highest accomplishments of human culture and art occurred under bourgeois society. So what Lenin and Trotsky said was, once we solve the problem of literacy, once we've opened up the gilded gates of Russia's immense cultural legacy, you know, throwing open the doors of the opera houses and the theaters and the art galleries, giving the working class the means to access the wealth of cultural treasures available. Let them master that. Let them master Shakespeare. Let them master Gautier. Let them master Tchaikovsky and Dostoevsky, and then build from there. And I think that this is a point which has come out in a number of the pieces that we've released in the last few years in the IDOM about art, but also articles on the website, also lead-offs that comrades have delivered, that the reason, or one of the reasons that we take art seriously is, first of all, it's not something that you can be expected to just know how to understand. Learning how to understand art is a skill. It takes education. It takes time and practice and study. And if we're serious about trying to build the vanguard party of the working class, the party that will guide the working class to victory and create the basis for the working class to be the ruling class, then creating the basis for the working class to really conquer culture is part of its training to become the ruling class, right? The reason that Lenin and Trotsky rejected the idea of developing a proletarian art is because the proletariat is what? It's an oppressed class which is cut off for most of the time from the highest accomplishments of bourgeois culture. It's, at the time they were writing, particularly in Russia, cut off from the absolute basics of education and literacy. So actually, the culture that the working class mostly engages in and is capable at the moment of producing isn't to the highest level. That's the thing we have to overcome. So I think that it's really important that when we talk about art, we don't sort of look for the stuff which feels proletarian, which feels like gritty and homespun necessarily. No, I say that we should have the working class begin with the highest accomplishments of the old society and rebuild society in their image. And the point that Lenin and Trotsky made is, at the point that the working class becomes the ruling class, it's already undergoing the process of dismantling class society altogether. So the idea of proletarian art kind of loses all meaning because the working class is trying to abolish itself as a class, and therefore the idea of proletarian arts. What you're trying to create with the workers' state is really human arts for the first time in history. Art where everyone can participate in its creation. Everyone can participate. And it relates to something that I think Josh said. I'm really glad that he brought up Dziga Vertov because he's one of my favorite Soviet directors. And it's really interesting when you compare Man with a Movie Camera to the kind of rubbish that was produced under the Stalinist bureaucracy, so-called Soviet realism or socialist realism, which was neither socialist nor reflecting the reality of the Soviet people. And the film from that era that I always like to put side by side with Man with a Movie Camera to show just how far things fell under the stultifying influence of the bureaucracy is this film from, I think it's from 1937 or something. It's called Tractor Drivers. And it's a peppy little musical, sort of in the style of Hollywood, showing these suspiciously well-fed looking Ukrainian farmers driving around the countryside singing happy songs about how great it is to be driving their tractors around the countryside. If you know anything about the state of the Ukrainian countryside in 1937, no one should be that well-fed and no one should be that happy. I don't know what I'd call that, but I certainly wouldn't call it realism. Whereas what Dziga Vertov showed, as Josh explained very well in his excellent intervention, is the real sinews of Soviet life. Exactly, warts and all, the good and the bad, the things which showed the real humanity that was emerging in that revolutionary period, the optimism and the dynamism, but also the terrible backwardness and the potential for tragedy and the things that are still to be done. And that brings me to one of the questions: how to create good Marxist art? I was really tempted to be pithy and answer, don't. But I'm not going to do that because that would be a little bit crass. What I will say is that Trotsky makes a good point about propaganda, where he said that propaganda can be excellent, it can be really good, it can be artistically really effective, but it can never be truly great art. And the reason for that is by its very function, it's not able to tell a multi-sided truth because its function is to defend a particular political purpose, right? If you were to do a piece of propaganda that revealed the full truth about the working class, which is that they're not angels, they have a bad side, they've got problems like everybody else, it wouldn't necessarily be as effective as a piece of propaganda. It's not what you need at the height of, say, the Russian Civil War, for example. So I would say that the best art made by people who are Marxists, it tends not to be didactic. No one likes to be lectured to, he says from the podium, but you take my point. No one likes to be lectured to through art because it's dull, it's not interesting, it's not multi-sided. There's a purpose for a lecture. If you come to a lecture, you expect a lecture, you expect to be taught. If you engage in art, you want to see an authentic reflection of someone else's view of the world. I think that's broadly the case. I was thinking about an example that would be useful. I just finished reading the trilogy of historical novels by Hilary Mantel, Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies, and The Mirror and the Light. If you haven't read them, they're really, really good. Hilary Mantel was in the Communist Party. She, I think, dropped out, but she obviously had a little bit of a education. She obviously had a bit of an understanding of dialectical materialism. She also had a background in academic study of history, so she knew her stuff. The books are about Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII's court, and they're a really interesting read because you can tell she understands historical materialism. You can tell she kind of understands the dynamics of history underway. You can tell she kind of understands the weird way that class struggle was expressed at that time, like during the kind of low period or the declining period of feudalism, where class struggle was presented in terms of conflict between different religious sects, and you had a kind of rising bourgeois that was starting to put its stamp on society. Thomas Cromwell was that. He was an upstart. He was the son of a blacksmith who became one of the most powerful men in England. I think that's a good example of someone who was at least of a Marxist persuasion or a Marxist flavor, applying something that they've learned from the philosophy of Marxism to art in a way which is useful and makes good art. I think that's a bit different from making Marxist art. Is it democratic when slop is popular? Is it democratic when junk food is popular? Is it democratic when religion is popular? I mean, these are things that are clearly powerful and popular, but what do they reflect? They reflect the currently low level and low sides of society where the majority of people are crushed by exploitation and oppression. So no, basically. They reflect the lack of democracy. They reflect the domination, the spiritual and ideological domination of the working class in a period where it's an oppressed and exploited class. What else? Eisenstein. You know, he went to Hollywood and tried to make a movie adapting Marx's Capital. And I'm not surprised that he was a bit depressed by that experience. But again, the policy of the early Soviet Republic towards art is so different from the bourgeois caricature of the party line that just crushes any individual expression. And you don't have to take my word for it when I say that wasn't the case, because I've got a really good quote from a reactionary British historian, Oxford historian of Russian literature called Max Haywood. Hated the Bolsheviks, is a conservative, but he writes, "The revolutionary censorship's main function was to prevent the publication of overtly counter-revolutionary works. It did not interfere with basic literary freedom in matters of form and content." And I don't know if you've read Nelson Wan's really excellent article about Stanislavski, who basically invented what we understand now as the method, real acting in the tradition of realism. You wouldn't have cinematic realism as an theatrical tradition without Stanislavski. He basically invented the form of acting that we now understand as realism. And he was not a Marxist. He was not a communist. He openly said so. But he famously said that he was grateful to his government for not insisting that everybody paint themselves red and declare themselves something they weren't. Because that wasn't the policy of the Bolsheviks. Lenin and Trotsky were very clear. You needed, first of all, to solve the problem of bread, to educate the working class to be the ruling class and to develop, its cultural level. But in the meantime, to utilize the art and artists that existed and give people the freedom to experiment. I mean, Lenin declared himself a bit of an artistic conservative. He said that he kind of liked the classics and didn't really get the airy-fairy, artsy-fartsy, avant-garde stuff. I think he was being a bit unfair to himself there, actually. He had some interesting opinions about futurism and so on. Trotsky was very much into that sort of thing. And both of them said, look, our job is not to tell artists what art to make. Obviously, if these people, these petty bourgeois elements, are trying to organize counter-revolution under the guise of artistic practice and organizing these little art circles and so on, that's a different question. That's a political question. But in terms of just the sheer contents, I mean, Lenin always said that Marx's favorite author was Balzac. And the guy was a reactionary. He was a massive reactionary, but he really understood the culture of his day because he was a smart guy with his eyes open to the world. He saw the truth. So I think that our policy, our attitude with art should be, we don't insist that it necessarily blithely reflect our political program back at us, because that would limit it. That would limit art. That's not what we want. We want to allow art to be free to be itself, right? But the way that we achieve that is through transforming social relations. Because right now, as we've all been saying in various ways with many examples, art is constrained not by anything inherent to art, but by the social relations within which art exists. Lots of really good points. I mean, the Frankfurt School, what permeates the Frankfurt School is pessimism. They were people who were feeling the consequences of the Stalinist generation of the Soviet Union. They were seeing capitalism failing to be overthrown. They were watching the rise of fascism in Europe. And they were petty bourgeois academics who drew the conclusion the working class must have basically just been bamboozled and must have been brainwashed by mass media. They had fundamentally a very condescending attitude towards the working class, which we do not share. Streaming is an interesting question to me because that's a concrete example, I think, of in art, the conflict between the development of the productive forces and the overall mode of production. Because you've got a situation where anyone can access pretty much any piece of media anytime, which under socialism is fantastic. That means you have a treasure trove of media instantly available to anyone. Under capitalism, it's a nightmare because it's worthless now. That means that music, films, video games are all fundamentally worthless. The capitalists are struggling to fit streaming into the profit model. And the consequences of that are borne not by the capitalists, really, because individually they make a huge amount of money. It's borne by the artists, and it's borne by all of us. Pretty much anybody, theoretically, could compose an opera, could write a play, could make a film, could make a cartoon, what have you, in their bedrooms. But there's a kind of homogenization. There doesn't seem to be a breaking of the impasse of the broader cultural field. And that goes to show what I was trying to say at the end of my lead-off, that it's not a question of technique per se. When I said that film was the highest accomplishment of bourgeois art in potential, but it wasn't meeting the potential, it wasn't matching the peaks of bourgeois art that you see in Gautier and Beethoven and Mozart and Shakespeare and so on. The reason for that is that the peak of the bourgeois' ideological developments, of their philosophical and cultural developments, came many, many years before film was invented. That's the problem. That peak, that social peak, where the bourgeois were in their progressive phase and their heroic phase, where they produced their best thinkers, it didn't coincide with the technological development of these amazing tools that exist to us now. And isn't that true of so many things? AI has been mentioned. I have a very dim opinion about so-called generative art and so on, but AI is a potentially extremely powerful tool. Under a socialist society, it will be transformative. In principle, in fundamental principle, it's not a bad thing. It's just horribly misused, and it's used to immiserate and to further exploit and intensify the exploitation of the working class. But that's not something that's inherent to the technology. It's the result of how the society that we exist in utilizes that technology. That's the problem. The potential, the material potential to completely transform human relations and human culture and human society are at our fingertips, but they're constrained by a social and economic system that's long since outlived its right to life. And we need to put it to bed. Thanks.